My name is Maren Holt. I'm 62 years old. For most of my life, I believed that love could hold a family together the way nails hold up a roof. That evening, I learned how easily both can splinter. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary butter drifted through the kitchen. It was Sunday, the kind of slow Carolina evening that usually ended with pie and easy talk. My son Dylan sat across from me, his sleeves rolled up a silver watch flashing under the dining room light. I'd spent the day setting the table, polishing the old oak my husband and I refinished together years ago. The candles flickered between us, soft and steady. He barely looked at me while he ate, just pushed peas around his plate and scrolled through his phone. I thought maybe he was restless, tired from work. He'd moved back to Asheville 6 months earlier, saying he needed a change of pace. I believed him. I wanted to. When I asked how his day had gone, he set down his fork, slow and deliberate, and said, "We need to talk." Something in his tone, flat practiced, made my stomach clench. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a folded document on the table. His eyes didn't meet mine. "I filed the transfer last month," he said. "The deed's in my name now." The words landed so softly, I almost didn't understand them. The house, he went on, gesturing at the walls around us, the hardwood floor I'd sanded by hand. "It's mine. You have 2 days to get your stuff out." For a moment, the room disappeared. I heard only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rush of blood in my ears. "You're joking," I said, though I knew he wasn't. "I'm not." He leaned back, crossing his arms like it was a business matter, not a mother and son sitting at the same table they'd shared for decades. "It's done, Mom. The paperwork's legal. You'll have time to move your things." He said it like he was doing me a favor. My throat tightened. The words I wanted to say, "How could you," or "why," stuck somewhere behind my ribs. I stared at the candle between us, at the soft wax pooling around its base, and felt something sharp and cold settle inside me. I looked down at the document. My name was there, printed in neat black ink, followed by a signature that looked close enough to mine to pass. The room swayed. I gripped the edge of the table. "You forged this," he shrugged. "It's complicated. The house was still under Dad's name when you refinanced. I just corrected it. You'll be better off somewhere smaller. You've got your savings right." I wanted to slap him, to shout until the neighbors heard, but I didn't. I simply pushed my chair back, the legs scraping the hardwood. 2 days, I asked. "That's fair," he said. I nodded. Then I stood and began clearing the plates. The chicken, untouched on his side, had gone cold. "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be." I stacked the dishes and walked to the sink. My hands trembled only once when I turned on the water. Steam rose, curling like smoke between us. "You should go," I said quietly. He hesitated, maybe expecting tears or pleading. When he didn't get either, he grabbed his jacket and left without another word. The door closed, and the sound of his car faded down the drive. I turned off the faucet. The kitchen was silent, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar, older, smaller somehow, but my eyes were steady. I wiped my hands on a towel, folded it carefully, and set it on the counter. Then I walked through each room of the house, the living room with the hand-sewn curtains, the hallway lined with photographs of a younger, happier family, the bedroom where Ben and I once planned our future. By the time I reached the front porch, the last of the daylight had vanished. The air smelled of rain and pine. I sat on the steps, feeling the grain of the old wood beneath my palms. 2 days. I whispered the words once, testing their shape in the dark. Then I stood, went inside, and locked the door behind me. Tomorrow, I'd find out exactly what he'd done. The next morning, I woke to the creak of the old floorboards and the soft patter of rain on the porch roof. The house always spoke to me that way, every sound familiar, almost alive. For years, those sounds had been my company after Ben died. He'd passed in the early spring just after the dogwoods bloomed. I remember sitting on this same porch, staring at the paint peeling from the rails, realizing how much of him still lingered in every corner. The house was falling apart, then roof-leaking porch, sagging walls bruised by water stains, but it was all I had left of us. So I decided to rebuild it. I started small. New shingles, fresh siding, sanding the floors until my palms blistered. Every paycheck from the drafting firm went straight into supplies, paint, nails, beams, the good kind that didn't warp in humidity. Neighbors offered help, but I wanted to do it myself. There was something sacred about the work, about learning how to hold a hammer steady while your world keeps shaking. By that first winter, the house began to look alive again. Warm amber lights glowed through the windows. I repainted the living room in the same color Ben once called sunset oak. When the nights turned cold, I'd stand in that room with a cup of tea and think, we made it love. You and me somehow. Dylan visited once that year, wearing a pressed shirt and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said Florida was full of opportunity. I handed him a jar of jam I'd made and told him to call when he got settled. He never did. Over the next few years, the pattern stayed the same: his short visits, big promises, quiet disappearances. Meanwhile, I refinished every door frame, replaced every rusted hinge, filled the silence with the hum of a sander and the smell of varnish. People in town began calling it the Holt house again, the way they did when Ben was alive. I'd nod and smile, proud but tired. I thought the hardest part of rebuilding was behind me. I thought love and labor had sealed every crack that grief left behind. I didn't know back then that I'd have to rebuild it all again, this time not from rot, but from betrayal. That night, the house felt different. The air was too still, the walls too quiet, as if they were listening. I sat at the dining table with a stack of folders spread out before me. Old mortgage statements, tax receipts, loan records I'd kept since Ben passed. I'd always prided myself on keeping things in order. Numbers had a rhythm, a language that never lied. But as I flipped through the papers, something didn't make sense. The last mortgage summary, dated only 3 months earlier, showed an increase in monthly escrow fees, hundreds more than I remembered paying. The notice looked official, yet the signature at the bottom wasn't from my loan officer. I frowned, comparing it with older letters. The font was slightly different, the logo darker. I reached for the small desk lamp and turned up the light. The ink shimmered faintly, like it had been printed on a newer machine. I checked the bank envelope. It was addressed to me, but listed a P.O. box I'd never used. A dull ache spread across my temples. I had refinanced the house 6 years ago, and the paperwork hadn't changed since. Why now? Why all these extra charges? I pulled my check register from the drawer and began tracing every payment for the past year. Each matched, except for one, an automatic debit I didn't recognize. The memo line read, "Equity adjustment fee." Ben and I had paid off most of the mortgage before he died. There was no reason for an equity adjustment. None. I tried to steady my breathing, but my hands had started to shake. I turned toward the hallway, half expecting to hear footsteps, his or Dylan's, but the house stayed silent, holding its breath with me. I pushed the papers aside and went to the small file cabinet near the pantry, the one where I kept copies of every major document. My fingers brushed across labeled folders. Taxes, insurance, utilities, deed. I pulled the last one out. Inside were the original closing papers. Ben's careful signature beside mine, the notary's embossed seal still faintly raised against the page. For years, those papers had been my comfort, a reminder that the home we built was safe, anchored in law as much as love. But now the printed lines seemed to shift under the lamplight, their certainty crumbling. I took a deep breath and returned to the dining table. The chair creaked as I sat down again. I laid the original deed next to the recent letter from the bank and stared at them side by side. They didn't match. Not the notary ID, not even the closing reference number. Someone had changed it. My pulse quickened. I thought of Dylan's folded document on the table the night before, the one he said proved the house was his. I'd assumed it was bravado, another one of his schemes that would collapse within a week. But now something colder crept in. I gathered the papers into a neat pile and pressed my palm against them to stop their trembling. The edge of one envelope cut my skin, a thin, bright sting. Somewhere inside, these numbers, a lie was waiting. And whoever had written it had counted on me never looking close enough to see. Sleep never came. I lay awake, listening to the rain ticking against the windows. The same rhythm Ben once said sounded like the house breathing. By dawn, my thoughts had looped so many times I could no longer tell fear from anger. At 6, I got up, made coffee and opened the curtains. Mist drifted across the yard, settling over the porch railings I'd painted last summer. Everything looked normal, but I knew better. Something had shifted beneath the surface, invisible, but certain. I found my phone on the counter and scrolled through my contacts until I reached Claire Jennings. We hadn't spoken in months, not out of distance, just the quiet drift that happens when years blur together. She'd been my neighbor once before she moved into town to work for a real estate attorney. The line rang twice. Maren. Her voice was warm, still edged with that quick efficiency that had always steadied me. "Sorry to call this early," I said. "I think something's wrong with the house." She didn't hesitate. "Tell me." I explained everything. The dinner, Dylan's sudden claim, the document with my forged signature, the strange mortgage letters. My voice shook once, but I kept talking. Claire listened, the way she always had, no interruptions, no disbelief. When I finished, she let out a slow breath. "Maren," she said, "I know this is hard to hear, but if he's filed anything under your name, it'll be in the county records. Property transfers have to be public. I can't access them myself without authorization, but you can. Go down there first thing. Pull everything under your address, even if it looks old." I gripped the phone tighter. "You think he actually—" "I think it's possible," she said gently. "And if that's true, we'll deal with it. But don't call him. Don't confront him yet. Just get the paperwork." Her steadiness seeped through the line, a small anchor against the panic that had followed me since dinner. "Claire," I whispered. "How could he do something like this?" "Desperation makes people reckless," she said. "And family makes it complicated. But you're not powerless, Maren. You've handled tougher things." The words landed heavier than she knew. I thought of the years after Ben died, late nights drafting building plans to pay the mortgage, learning how to fix what I couldn't afford to replace. Back then, the house had been my shield against the world. Now, it had become the battlefield itself. "I'll go as soon as they open," I said finally. "Good. Bring your ID, the old deed, and that letter from the bank. And call me after." We hung up, and for a long time I just stood there, the phone still warm in my hand. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the sharp outline of the mountains beyond the yard. For the first time in days, I felt something steady flicker inside me. Not peace, not yet, but the faintest trace of resolve. Tomorrow, I would stop guessing and start knowing. By the time the Buncombe County office opened, the fog had burned away, leaving the streets washed clean and cold. I parked along the curb, clutching a folder against my chest, the edges damp from my palms. The building was squat and pale, with fluorescent lights that hummed faintly through the windows. Inside, the air smelled of paper and toner. A clerk at the front desk looked up a young woman with a loose bun and a name tag that read S. Mallory. She smiled the polite, practiced way people do when they expect routine business. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I need property records," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Address is a 104 Sycamore Drive." She typed something into her computer, the clack of keys echoing in the quiet room. "You're listed as the current owner." I hesitated. I should be. Her brow creased slightly as she turned to a filing drawer and pulled out a slim folder. She slid it toward me across the counter. "You can review it at that table. Please don't remove any originals." I carried it to the corner desk, the one near the window, where sunlight fell in a bright square across the wood. I unfolded the first document and saw my name typed neatly across the top, Maren L. Holt. The ink was black, crisp, recent. Below it, another name, Dylan Holt. The line between them read, "Transfer of title residential property. Filed 6 weeks ago." My throat closed. I flipped to the second page. There, in looping blue ink, was my signature, or at least something meant to be. The curve of the M was close, but off the L, missing its familiar tail. I stared at it so long the letters blurred. Below, a notary's stamp pressed into the paper like a wound-approved P. Cartwright. The name struck me. Paul Cartwright. Dylan's old business partner, the one who used to sell investment packages out of a shared office near downtown. I remembered him shaking my hand at a Christmas party years ago, his grin wide, his suit too shiny. I turned the page again. Each sheet felt heavier than the last. Attached to the file was a photocopy of Dylan's driver's license, his address listed as the house itself, my house, and a note stating that the transfer had been verified in person. I could hear my pulse in my ears. The clerk glanced over. "Everything okay, ma'am?" I swallowed hard. "Yes," I lied. She returned to her desk, leaving me alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft rustle of paper. I took out my phone and began photographing each page carefully. First the transfer, then the notary stamp, the license copy, the witness page. My fingers trembled, but I kept the camera steady. The soft click of the shutter became a rhythm, something to hold on to. When I finished, I returned the folder to the counter. The clerk offered a receipt copy for the records request. I thanked her and walked out into the sunlight. The brightness hit me like a slap. I stood on the courthouse steps, phone clutched tight, scrolling through the images one by one. My name, my forged signature, the stamp. Proof undeniable. A man in a gray suit brushed past me, muttering apologies, and I realized I hadn't moved in nearly a minute. I drew a deep breath, but it did nothing to steady me. The world had tilted. The ground I thought was solid, my home, my son, my trust had been traded for a stack of false papers and an ink mark I didn't make. I walked to the car, each step heavier than the last. Inside, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. The seatbelt clicked into place with a hollow sound. The phone rested in my lap, the photos glowing faintly on the screen. They were proof of what he'd done. Clear, damning, irreversible. But the proof didn't feel like victory. It felt like loss with a signature. I gripped the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. The courthouse stood behind me, the mountains beyond it silent and indifferent. Somewhere in between, Something inside me hardened, not into hate, not yet, but into something colder and sharper. Whatever this was, it wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was war written in ink. When I pulled into the driveway that afternoon, the house looked almost peaceful in the late light. The porch beams caught the gold of the setting sun, the same ones I'd replaced with my own hands after the old wood had rotted through. For a moment, I wanted to believe nothing had changed. But the phone in my pocket said otherwise. Proof lived there now, proof of what my son had done. I was still sitting in the car when I noticed someone crossing the yard. It was Margaret Greer, my next-door neighbor, carrying a basket covered with a linen cloth. She had that careful kindness that comes from seeing too much in life and judging none of it. Her husband, Henry, followed behind, slower, waving politely. "I saw your car pull in," she said. "Thought you could use some supper." Henry made stew. The gesture nearly broke me. I managed to smile and took the basket, the warmth seeping through the cloth into my hands. "Thank you," I said. "You didn't have to." "Well," she replied, "people don't always do what they have to. Sometimes they just do what's right." We sat on the porch steps, bowls balanced on our knees, steam rising into the cool air. I told them a piece of the truth about the deed transfer, the forged signature, the visit to the county office. I left out the worst of it, the part where Dylan's name had been written above mine like a verdict. Henry listened quietly, his weathered hands resting on the railing. When I finished, he nodded once. "I remember seeing you up there, fixing that roof yourself," he said. "You were out there every weekend for months. If anyone asks, we'll tell them." Margaret reached over and touched my arm. "You've put your whole life into this place. Everyone in the neighborhood knows that." Her words shouldn't have meant so much, but they did. They landed somewhere deep in the space Dylan's voice used to fill. As twilight fell, porch lights flickered on up and down the street. The Greers stayed a little longer, talking about small things, the farmer's market, the storm forecast, the smell of honeysuckle that would come with June. Normal things. The kind that remind you life still exists outside the walls that hurt you. When they finally stood to leave, Henry turned back. "If there's trouble, you call us first. You shouldn't have to face this alone." I watched them cross the yard, the light catching their silhouettes before the dark swallowed them. For the first time since the dinner, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt like the town itself was standing watch steady and unspoken, while I gathered the pieces of what was left. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The sky outside was a deep indigo, the kind that blurs mountains into shadows. My coffee sat untouched as I watched the first light creep across the porch, outlining the house I no longer trusted. By 8, I was on the phone with the locksmith. The man who arrived was older, quiet, his gray hair tucked under a faded baseball cap. He didn't ask why I wanted every lock changed, just nodded, gathered his tools, and got to work. The sound of the drill bit against metal was sharp and deliberate, like a heartbeat I could finally control. With every turn of the wrench, something in me steadied. When he handed me the new set of brass keys, the metal still warm from his hands, I felt a small but solid weight of certainty. From there, I drove to the bank. The clerk at the counter, a young woman named Lily, recognized me from years of visits. "Morning, Ms. Holt. Need to make a withdrawal." "Not exactly," I said. "I need to freeze every line of credit linked to my name. All accounts, all cards." Her smile faltered, but she nodded. "Of course. I'll help you through it." She didn't ask questions, and I was grateful. Within half an hour, the process was complete, accounts locked, alerts set. Before leaving, I opened a new safety deposit box and placed the originals of my deed, Ben's will, and the house insurance policy inside. The clang of the metal door closing was strangely comforting, like the sound of a vault sealing against the storm. On the way home, I stopped by Claire's office. She worked in a narrow brick building off Pack Square, her desk cluttered with sticky notes and stacks of files. She looked up as soon as I walked in. I pulled the county scans, she said, motioning me to sit. Everything matches what you found. The transfer's real, but it's fraudulent. We'll file for an emergency injunction to void it before he tries to leverage the property. She slid a form across the desk, already half filled. I'll need your signature and a copy of your ID. I signed where she pointed my hand, steady this time. She smiled faintly. You're handling this better than most people would. I don't feel like I am, I said. Maybe not. But that doesn't mean you're not doing it. Her words followed me out the door. I stopped at a hardware store for a motion sensor light and a small safe for the house. By the time I returned home, the air had turned heavy, the wind carrying the scent of rain. I spent the afternoon installing the new lights along the porch, testing each one until it flared bright at the slightest movement. The safe went under the bed tucked behind a box of Ben's old sketchbooks. Inside it, I placed copies of every document photos from the courthouse bank records, the letter from Dylan. I still couldn't throw away. When the rain finally came, it arrived in sheets, loud against the roof. I walked through the house slowly, turning off lights, checking windows, tracing the familiar grain of wood along the door frames. In the hallway, the photographs of our family caught the dim light. Ben in his workshop, Dylan at 10 years old, grinning with a missing front tooth. I paused there longer than I meant to. I whispered goodnight to Ben, then to the house itself, and to the version of my life that had ended without ceremony. The air smelled of wet earth and old paint. Somewhere outside, the motion light flicked on, then off again. For the first time in days, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was simply aware of it and ready for whatever would move within it. The morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of light that seemed to press down rather than rise. The forecast called for storms, though the air outside was still an uneasy calm before something inevitable. I had 24 hours left. That was the time Dylan had given me, and though I no longer believed in his authority over anything in this house, the number itself had become a clock I couldn't silence. Every tick felt like a reminder of what I had to do before he returned. I made a list on a yellow notepad: pack essentials, move valuables, install cameras. Beside it, I drew a line for every task finished. It was how I had survived the months after Ben's death: make lists, check boxes, keep moving. Motion was a shield. By mid-morning, I was in the attic, dust rising in the slanted light. The air smelled of cedar and old summers. Boxes lined the beams, holiday decorations, old drafting tools, photo albums thick with years. I wasn't ready to look at the photos, not yet, but I took Ben's toolbox and carried it downstairs. In the living room, I began to sort things into piles. A stack of documents for Claire, a smaller one for the bank. The things that truly mattered, letters, sketches, and Ben's pocket watch, I placed in a single box labeled Keep. It wasn't much, considering how long we'd built this life together, but it was what I could carry without breaking. At noon, I went to the hardware store for the second time that week. The clerk, a quiet man named Joe, who'd known me for years, asked if I was fixing something again. Something like that, I said. I bought 3 small security cameras and a pack of batteries. He offered to send someone to install them, but I told him I'd manage. I always had. Back home, the first camera went over the front porch, angled toward the driveway. The second faced the back gate where the fence met the trees. The third I set in the hallway, its tiny light blinking red when motion triggered it. It was strange to think that my own house now needed surveillance. Still, The sight of those quiet red dots calmed me. They were proof that I wasn't helpless. By late afternoon, exhaustion set in. I sat on the edge of the bed, the box of keepsakes beside me, and opened Ben's watch. The glass was scratched from years of wear. The hands stopped at 6:42. I turned it over in my palm and found the small, folded note I'd tucked into the back years ago, yellowed and creased from time. Protect what we built, not who breaks it. I'd written those words myself after the first time Dylan disappeared for months and came back asking for money. Ben had said something like it before he died, and I had written it down, a reminder for later, though I never thought I'd need it like this. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, long and low. I got up, double-checked the windows, and moved through each room one last time. The living room smelled faintly of lemon polish, the floors clean enough to reflect the fading light. The kitchen counters were bare, except for a kettle and one mug. When the rain finally came, it arrived in sheets that blurred the glass. I watched the driveway fill with water, the porch lights flickering against the storm. I'd always loved the sound of rain here. It had been comfort. Once a sign that the roof I fixed with my own hands held strong. Now it sounded different, restless, watchful. As evening fell, I packed the last of my clothes into a suitcase. The motion camera blinked faintly behind me, recording every step. I wasn't sure if I did it for protection or proof. Maybe both. The clock on the wall read 9:30. In less than a day, he would come back expecting to find me gone or broken enough to leave quietly. But he didn't know what kind of woman he'd made me become. I set the suitcase by the front door and went to the window. The reflection staring back at me didn't look like the woman who had served Sunday dinners or waited for phone calls that never came. She looked older, steadier, harder. The thunder moved closer. The porch light flashed once, then steadied. I stood there until my breathing matched the rhythm of the storm. Tomorrow would decide everything, what stayed, what left, what was mine to keep. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid of losing. I was afraid of leaving anything undone. By morning, the storm had passed. The air was clean and cold, carrying that sharp scent of pine and wet soil that always followed heavy rain. Sunlight broke through the clouds, cutting thin gold lines across the yard. It was almost beautiful, too beautiful for what the day would bring. I had been awake for hours. My hands shook only once while I poured coffee. Everything that needed to be done was already in place. Cameras charged, documents printed, copies sent to Claire. The sheriff's office had confirmed they would be here before noon. By 11, I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A black pickup stopped at the end of the drive, followed by a smaller silver sedan. The air went still again, as if even the wind didn't want to intrude. Dylan stepped out first. He wore dark jeans, a pressed shirt, and the same smug calm he used to wear when he thought charm could fix anything. Two men got out behind him, both younger, the kind of friends who follow trouble like moths to a flame. They spoke quietly as they walked up the path, laughter sharp and careless. I stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. The new lock gleamed under the sunlight. When he reached the porch, Dylan smiled the kind of smile that pretends history can be rewritten. "You're still here," he said. "Didn't I give you 2 days?" "You did," I said, my voice steady. "And I used them." He frowned, as if trying to read something in my face. Behind him, one of the men adjusted his cap, impatient. "We can start bringing stuff in, right?" he asked. "Not yet," Dylan said, still watching me. "Mom, you didn't make this hard, did you?" Before I could answer, a cruiser pulled up beside his truck. The sheriff's vehicle was unmistakable sunlight, flashing off its side mirror. Dylan's smile faltered. Deputy Markham stepped out, a tall man I'd met earlier that morning when he came to review the injunction paperwork. His voice was calm but firm as he approached. Mr. Holt Dillon turned toward him, irritation rising in his face. "Yeah, I'm here on behalf of the Buncombe County Court," Markham said. "We have notice of a disputed property transfer filed under your name. Until the case is reviewed, no one is to remove, enter, or occupy the premises without authorization." He handed Dillon the sealed document. The porch went silent except for the faint buzz of insects in the grass. Dillon took the paper but didn't read it. "This is ridiculous," he said. "That's my house." Markham's tone didn't change. "Not according to this injunction, it isn't." Dillon turned to me, then, his voice rising. "You called them. You really did this." I met his eyes. "You did this when you forged my name." For a second, the air between us cracked, something mean and wordless twisting in his expression. The friends shifted uneasily behind him. "You think you can humiliate me like this?" he snapped. Markham stepped closer. "Sir, I suggest you calm down." "I'm calm," Dillon shouted, but his voice betrayed him. The confidence he'd worn like armor was slipping fast. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Justice had a voice louder than mine ever could. The deputies began documenting the scene, taking photographs of the porch and driveway, noting the property's condition for the case file. Every click of their camera sounded like punctuation proof, sealing each lie he'd told. Across the street, Henry and Margaret Greer stood by their mailbox, watching quietly. Margaret raised a hand, not to wave, but to show she was there. Witnesses steady, unspoken. The town that had once just nodded in greeting now stood as my silent defense. Dillon looked around, realization sinking in. "You had them all watching me. I didn't need to," I said. "You made yourself visible." He tried to speak again, but couldn't. His friends muttered something about leaving, and within minutes, the silver car rolled back down the drive. Dillon hesitated longer, clutching the folded paper like it might change if he just held it tightly enough. Finally, he turned, shoulders stiff, and walked toward his truck. The engine started revved once, then faded down the road. The quiet that followed was so deep, it felt like an exhale years in the making. Deputy Markham lingered to confirm the notice was served. "If he tries to come back, call us directly," he said. "He won't get past the gate." I nodded, thanked him, and watched as the cruiser disappeared down the road. When I stepped back inside, the house was still. The light through the windows caught dust motes drifting like tiny sparks. On the counter lay the spare key, one of the new ones smooth and cold in my palm. I closed my fingers around it and exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, the air in my home felt entirely mine. 3 weeks later, the courthouse smelled of old paper and lemon polish. The morning light slanted through the tall windows, dust swirling in quiet patterns that seemed almost suspended in time. I sat on a wooden bench beside Claire, hands folded over my lap, the papers she'd organized resting neatly in her briefcase. Across the aisle, Dillon sat with his attorney, a man too young, too polished, his confidence mismatched with the tired slump of my son beside him. Dillon's hair was shorter now, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. When he looked at me, there was no anger left, just something hollow and unspoken. The bailiff called the case. Claire rose, first composed and deliberate. I followed the click of my shoes echoing in the chamber. The judge, a tall woman with gray hair pulled into a knot, adjusted her glasses and glanced between us. "Case 24-107, she read aloud. "Holt versus Holt. Allegation fraudulent transfer of property and identity misrepresentation." Her voice carried no judgment, only gravity. "Are both parties ready to proceed?" Claire nodded. "For the plaintiff, Your Honor." The defense attorney stood his tie slightly askew, ready for the respondent. The hearing began. Claire's voice was calm, her words sharp, as she unfolded the story. My signature forged, the notary false, the transfer filed 6 weeks before the confrontation. She presented photographs, the affidavit from the Greers, and the notarized statement from the locksmith, confirming the locks had been changed by me, not by Dylan. I sat still as she spoke. My hands clasped so tightly I could feel the pulse in my palms. Every sentence was both validation and heartbreak. The facts were clear, but they were still my family's ruins laid bare in a public room. When the defense took their turn, Dylan's lawyer argued desperation. He said Dylan had misunderstood the ownership documents, that his actions were misguided, but not malicious. I could see the tremor in my son's hand as he shifted the papers in front of him. The judge listened in silence, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned to Dylan. "Mr. Holt, do you have anything to say before I make my ruling?" He hesitated, looking down at his shoes. "I just wanted to fix things," he muttered. "I thought she'd be better off somewhere smaller." I didn't mean his voice broke. For a second, he looked like the boy who used to build forts in the backyard and call them castles. But then I remembered the forged papers, the arrogance at the dinner table, the way he'd said, "You have 2 days." The judge nodded once, scribbling something in her notes. "I've reviewed the evidence," she said. "The plaintiff has demonstrated that the property transfer was fraudulent and executed without consent. The deed will be reverted to Ms. Holt immediately. Additionally, the court orders restitution of associated legal costs and the reversal of all financial transactions tied to the false claim." A quiet gasp escaped me before I could stop it. It was done. The judge paused, studying me. "Ms. Holt, are you seeking further damages or criminal charges?" Claire looked to me, ready with her prepared motion. But I shook my head. My voice, when it came, was soft but certain. "No, Your Honor. I just want it made right." The judge's gaze lingered for a moment, then softened. "That's your right to choose. Judgment entered in your favor." She struck the gavel once, a sharp sound that filled the room. As people began to stand, Claire turned to me. "You could have asked for more," she whispered. "I already did," I said, "just not from the court." We gathered our things quietly. Dylan didn't approach me, though he looked as if he might. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him out the side door. I watched him go until the echo of his steps disappeared. Outside, the light was brighter than I expected. Claire walked with me to the courthouse steps, then stopped. "You know," she said, "not many people would have handled it like this." "I didn't want to destroy him," I said, gazing down at the folder in my hands. "I just wanted to stop pretending he hadn't already done it himself." She gave a small nod and left me there, her heels fading against the pavement. I stood alone for a long while, the sun warming the top of my head, the courthouse behind me, tall and unmoved. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, all I felt was tired, like someone who'd just finished cleaning a wound that would never quite stop aching. When I finally turned to go, the light caught the brass key hanging from my necklace. It glinted once, brief and quiet, before the wind shifted and carried me home. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that hummed rather than rested. Papers were gone, signatures erased. My name returned to the deed, yet the silence pressed heavier than ever. Justice had been done, but it didn't sound like peace. I moved through each room slowly, letting the stillness settle. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon oil and rain, the same as when Dylan was small. The afternoon light fell across the floor in long strips, touching the worn boards where his crayons had once rolled away from his little hands. I could still see him there, 5 years old, cross-legged on the tiles, drawing a picture of our house with crooked windows and a sun that took up half the sky. "It's us," he'd said, proudly holding it up to show me. Ben and I had laughed, hanging it on the refrigerator until the paper yellowed. I'd kept it for years folded carefully among old letters, but I wasn't sure where it was now. Maybe somewhere in the attic, maybe already gone. That memory came to me now like a ghost. I sat down at the table and traced the faint line in the wood where his pencil had once scratched too hard. My fingers lingered there, as if I could reach through time and touch the part of him that hadn't yet learned how to lie. Outside, wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth through the open window. I closed my eyes and let it in. It wasn't forgiveness I felt, at least not yet, but something quieter. Something that lived beside grief. The kind of sorrow that comes when you realize love doesn't die all at once. It fades in pieces, leaving echoes behind. On the counter sat Ben's old radio, dusty but still working. I turned it on the static, giving way to a low country song. The singer's voice cracked around the edges, worn but steady. I thought of Ben again, how he used to hum to the same tune while fixing the porch rails, his rhythm sure and patient. He would have hated what had happened between me and our son, but he would have understood the choice I made. I walked to the back door and looked out at the yard. The magnolia tree stood tall near the fence blossoms just beginning to open. Beneath it, the ground was still scarred where Dylan's truck had torn through during the storm. Grass would grow back eventually. It always did. As dusk settled, I brewed tea and sat by the window, the brass key warm against my collarbone. Somewhere in town, Dylan existed in a different kind of silence, his own reckoning, his own distance. I didn't wish him harm, only clarity. Maybe one day he'd remember that little boy on the kitchen floor and understand what he'd broken. Until then, I would live with the quiet he left behind, learning slowly how to let it become something softer. The decision came quietly, without drama or tears. One morning, as the sun slipped across the kitchen floor and caught the dust in the air, I realized I didn't belong to the house anymore. I had fought for it, protected it, even won it back. But what remained was no longer home. The walls carried too many echoes, too many versions of us layered over one another like fading paint. Each room held a shadow I couldn't soften. So I made coffee, sat at the table, and called a real estate agent I trusted. Her name was Emily Rhodes, a patient woman with a gentle voice who had helped Ben and me refinance once years ago. "Are you sure, Maren?" she asked after hearing my plan. "Yes," I said. "I just want to do it right this time. My way." Within a week, she brought buyers. A young couple walked through the house with careful awe, whispering to each other, as if the walls might listen. They noticed the details, how the grain of the wood changed near the window, where sunlight hit strongest, how the porch steps didn't creak even after all those years. The woman touched the banister and smiled. "It feels loved," she said. I nodded, because it was. Even with the hurt, the house had been loved. The sale went through faster than I expected. When Emily handed me the closing papers, her pen clicked softly between us. I signed my name, steady, deliberate, free. For once, no one else's hand hovered near mine. The proceeds went into a new account, in my name only. It wasn't just money. It was something cleaner, lighter. I didn't want a mansion or a grand rebuild. I wanted quiet. So I rented a small cottage on the edge of the French Broad River, not far from Asheville, but far enough to feel untouched by its noise. The cottage was plain white siding, green shutters, one bedroom, but the first night I unlocked the door, I felt something inside me exhale. The air smelled of pine and water. A screen door creaked faintly, and the wind carried the river's hush through the open window. I unpacked only what mattered: a box of Ben's sketches, the teapot, the folded note he once left me. On the dresser, I placed the brass house key. It had hung from the old front door for years, heavy and warm from the sun. I ran my thumb along its edge, then threaded it onto a thin chain and clasped it around my neck. It didn't feel like burden anymore. It felt like proof. Days found their rhythm again. I walked along the riverbanks in the early mornings, the mist curling low over the water. Sometimes I stopped to watch kayakers drift downstream or herons stand still among the reeds. The quiet was different here, not hollow but alive. Neighbors were few. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived 2 cottages down, brought me fresh tomatoes from her garden. A retired teacher named George waved every evening when he took his dog out for a walk. They didn't ask for my story, and I didn't offer it. It was enough to be seen simply as Maren, the woman in the white cottage by the river. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to crickets and the slow lap of water against stone. The brass key rested warm against my skin, catching the light from the lantern. It reminded me that sometimes survival isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to walk away with what's still yours. The house on Sycamore Drive belonged to someone else now. But the strength that built it, the hands that kept it standing, the voice that refused to break all of that came with me. And in this small, quiet place by the river, I finally understood that leaving wasn't losing. It was beginning again. Spring came early that year. The air carried a sweetness that clung to everything: the scent of wisteria, the hum of bees over the park's flower beds. I'd started spending mornings there, sitting on a wooden bench by the path overlooking the river. It was where I liked to write lists, drink coffee, and let the hours pass without hurry. One morning, an elderly woman sat down beside me. Her name was Ruth Miller, though she introduced herself simply as Ruth from the brick house near the post office. She held a manila folder in her lap, its edges soft and creased. After a few minutes of silence, she sighed. "They say I need to sign these to keep my name on the house," she murmured. "But I can't make sense of half of it." I looked at the paper's loan statements, property forms, something about a title update. The same careful language I'd once trusted without reading closely enough. My stomach tightened. "Who gave you these?" I asked gently. "My son," she said, embarrassed. "He said it's just to help with taxes. But he's been asking about selling lately. I don't want to lose my home, you see." The sunlight fell across her trembling hands, the paper shaking between her fingers. I took a slow breath, remembering how it had felt to sit in her place, to wonder if love could turn against you without warning. "Let's look through them together," I said. We spent the next hour reading line by line. I explained what each section meant, where her name appeared, where it didn't. When we reached the page that authorized a deed transfer, her eyes widened. She whispered, "He said it was just paperwork." "It always starts that way," I said quietly. I helped her mark the page, told her to bring it to the county office before signing anything. She thanked me so many times I lost count, pressing my hand between hers before leaving. Word must have spread faster than I expected. By the next week, 2 more people found me on that same bench, both older, both worried about property or paperwork they didn't understand. I didn't advertise, but somehow they knew. I printed extra copies of county forms, highlighted key sections, made simple guides. It wasn't much, just clarity passed hand to hand. Yet each person I helped seemed to lift a small part of the weight I still carried. Some afternoons, when the river shimmered gold and the bench grew warm under the sun, I'd touch the brass key around my neck and think of Ruth's grateful smile. The house I'd lost had taught me everything I needed to give back. And in those quiet hours by the water, I finally found a kind of peace that no deed could ever guarantee. Summer settled over the valley in slow, patient heat. The days stretched long by the river, and the air smelled of honeysuckle and cut grass. My life had found its rhythm again, quiet, measured, filled with small rituals that no one could take from me. Mornings on the porch with tea, afternoons helping neighbors sort through their paperwork, evenings watching the sky turn the color of old copper. It was on one of those afternoons that the letter came. The envelope was plain, the handwriting careful but shaky. My name, Maren Holt, stood alone in the center. No return address, only a postmark from a rehabilitation center outside Raleigh. I knew who it was before I opened it. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had once held his school projects, his birthday cakes, his laughter. The paper inside was lined, folded neatly in half. Mom, I don't know where to begin. They said part of this program is writing the people you hurt. I've been here 2 months. They make us work through what we did, not just the things we lost, but the people we broke. I thought I knew what ownership meant. I thought it was about money or success or control. You used to say it was about responsibility. I see that now. I took what wasn't mine, your name, your trust, and turned it into something ugly. I can't explain why I did it except that I was drowning and wanted someone else to carry the weight. You didn't deserve any of it. They're helping me rebuild from nothing. I work at the center's wood shop. Yesterday I sanded a table for hours and thought about you, how you used to do the same humming under your breath. I remembered the smell of sawdust in the house, and I realized everything I destroyed had come from your hands. From love. I'm sorry, Mom. I mean it this time. I don't expect an answer. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to be someone you wouldn't have to forgive because I already know I don't deserve it. Dylan. The words blurred as I read, though, not from tears, just from the ache of recognition. I folded the letter once, twice, and laid it flat on the table. Outside, the cicadas droned their endless summer song. I thought of him as a boy again, crouched on the kitchen floor with his crayons drawing crooked hearts on notebook paper. Somewhere between then and now, we'd both forgotten the shape of kindness. Maybe this was his way of finding it again. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been learned in silence. Instead, I slid the letter into a drawer with Ben's sketches and the old note that read, "Protect what we built, not who breaks it." Who? That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, I walked down to the riverbank. The water moved slow and steady, carrying bits of light with it. I reached into my pocket, felt the cool brass key between my fingers, and held it for a moment before letting my hand fall. The current kept going unbothered, unbroken, just as life should. I turned back toward the cottage, the letter still waiting in its drawer, and knew that sometimes the hardest form of forgiveness was simply choosing to live well. Autumn arrived quietly, the way forgiveness sometimes does, without an announcement, without asking to be noticed. The mornings along the French Broad River grew crisp, and silver mist rising from the water like breath. My cottage, small and square and steady, had begun to feel like an extension of that calm. I spent the early hours rearranging the shelves I'd built myself, planks of reclaimed wood from an old barn that had been torn down outside town. Each board carried its own story, a faint nail mark here, a groove where sunlight had once lived. I sanded them smooth-brushed on a coat of walnut oil and let the scent fill the room. On the top shelf, I placed a mason jar of wildflowers, from the edge of the trail goldenrod asters and one stubborn violet that refused to fade. Next to it sat Ben's teapot, its handle chipped still perfectly serviceable. Below that, a row of books, home repair manuals, field guides, and the poetry collection I used to read when the nights felt too long. I stood back and looked at the room. There wasn't much, just a chair by the window, a quilt folded neatly at its arm, and the low hum of the ceiling fan stirring the afternoon air. But it was mine, every inch of it. Not through ownership papers or legal proof, but through presence, through the quiet daily act of tending to what remains. Sometimes, when the sun angled just right, light poured through the window and scattered across the floorboards. I'd watch it crawl across the room until it reached my feet, warming the wood beneath me. That was when I felt closest to peace. I thought about Dylan now and then, not with anger, but with a kind of distant curiosity. His letter stayed in the drawer untouched since the day I'd read it. I didn't need to open it again. It had done what it needed to close the door without locking it. The lessons of the house on Sycamore Drive had followed me here, reshaped into something gentler. I used to think a home was built from devotion, that love alone could hold the walls upright. But now I knew better. A home needed respect, the kind that recognized limits, that understood love without ownership. Boundaries weren't barriers. They were beams. They held everything else in place. That afternoon, Mrs. Alvarez stopped by with a basket of apples from her garden. She stayed for tea, telling me about her grandson's school play and how she'd taken up watercolor painting. When she left, she pressed a small card into my hand, a delicate sketch of a house by the river smoke, curling from the chimney. "It reminded me of yours," she said with a smile. After she went, I placed the drawing on the wall beside the shelves. The ink lines were soft but confident. A home seen through someone else's eyes. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain. I stepped onto the porch wrapped in a shawl and listened to the first drops patter against the steps. The river murmured in the distance, constant and sure. Inside, the brass key rested against my collarbone, warm from the day. It no longer represented loss or memory. It was simply a part of me now, the way scars become skin. I turned off the lamp and stood in the doorway looking at the glow of the cottage from outside. The windows cast light across the grass, soft and golden. For years I had built repaired and defended walls to keep a home standing. Now I finally understood the strongest walls were the ones that asked for nothing except honesty to stay within them. And this time, I had built those walls for myself. A full year had passed since I left the house on Sycamore Drive. Seasons had turned like pages, each one softer than the last. Now it was early morning again, the kind of morning that makes you pause before speaking, as if sound itself might disturb the balance. Mist drifted low over the Blue Ridge Mountains, folding the valley in silver and pale blue. From my porch, I could see the river winding quietly below its surface, smooth as glass. The world was awake, but hushed, caught between breath and motion. I sat in my chair, a blanket over my knees, and held a mug of coffee between my hands. The steam curled upward, vanishing into the cool air. The brass key rested against my chest, catching faint glints of light. I still wore it every day, not as a relic, but as a reminder of everything that had survived with me. When I touched it now, it didn't sting. It simply felt solid, familiar, part of the quiet rhythm of the morning. A cardinal landed on the porch rail, red against the gray mist. It chirped once sharp and bright before flying toward the trees. I smiled. There was something reassuring about the way life continued, without waiting for permission. Inside the cottage smelled faintly of pine and fresh bread. I'd baked the loaf last night and left it to cool on the counter. Small things had become their own kind of joy, the act of preparing, of tending, of finishing what I started. For so many years I'd worked to hold others together. Now my only work was keeping peace from slipping away. Mrs. Alvarez passed by on her morning walk, waving from the road below. I waved back the mug, still in my hand. She'd offered to bring me along to the market later, and I'd said yes. The world I'd learned didn't shrink when you grew quiet. It only became more deliberate. The air shifted, carrying the scent of rain from somewhere deep in the hills. I breathed it in slowly, feeling it settle in my chest. This was what freedom felt like, not the grand, defiant kind, but the quiet one that came from belonging entirely to yourself. On the small table beside me sat Ben's old watch, the hands still stopped at 6:42. I'd thought about fixing it many times, but never did. It didn't need to move anymore. It was a marker of everything that had already been lived, the hours that built me the ones I'd finally learned to release. As the mist began to lift, sunlight spilled across the porch, warm and golden. It touched the rim of my cup, the curve of the key, the wooden boards beneath my bare feet. The day unfolded in silence, not waiting for anything, not demanding a story. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to defend my peace. It simply was steady, as the mountains clear as the river below, quiet as a promise kept. The mornings in Asheville had grown cooler again. Autumn light spilled across the foothills, soft and gold, catching the fog that hovered low over the French Broad River. From the porch of the community center, I could see the roofs of the small houses below their chimneys, sending up ribbons of smoke that curled into the dawn. It was the kind of view that made you breathe slower, as if the world itself had finally exhaled. Inside the building was already stirring with quiet energy. Coffee brewed in the corner and the murmur of conversation drifted through the hall. I'd started volunteering here 3 months ago, helping seniors review their home documents and understand their rights. It wasn't complicated work, but it mattered. Every week, someone came in clutching a folder, uncertain and afraid their trust, fraying at the edges just as mine once had. That morning, I sat beside an older man named Harold. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded a stack of papers. "My daughter says it's just refinancing," he said, voice low. "But they're asking me to sign this page here. It looks different from the others." We went through it line by line. The signature line had been moved, a clause slipped in beneath the fine print. I pointed to it gently. "That line gives up ownership," I explained. His eyes widened. "They almost had me," he whispered. "Not anymore," I said. When he left, he shook my hand twice and promised to come back with cookies for the class next week. I smiled after him, remembering how it felt to walk out of an office with your name still yours. At the end of the day, I gathered the leftover pamphlets and turned off the lights. The quiet filled the space like a companion. I'd come to love this hour when the work was done, and the only sound left was the rustle of wind outside the windows. On the way home, I drove the familiar winding road that led along the river. The leaves had begun to turn a shimmer of gold and red along the water's edge. I thought about the people I'd met here, the widows, the retirees, the parents rebuilding after loss. Each of them carried a story that began in fear, but ended in something stronger. When I reached the cottage, dusk had settled. I hung my coat by the door and set the folder from the center on the table. The key still rested around my neck, warm from my skin. I touched it lightly, tracing the grooves worn smooth by time. Outside, the first stars appeared above the blue ridgeline. The air was cool, crisp, with the promise of change. I made tea, opened the window, and listened to the quiet stretch through the hills. It was no longer the silence that once threatened to swallow me. It was the kind that protected, that spoke without sound. I stood for a long while at the window, watching the horizon shift from violet to deep blue. A year ago, I'd thought survival meant keeping what was mine. Now, I knew it meant knowing when to let go, when to start again, when to be still. The house, the river, the mountains, they all held their silence differently. Mine, I realized, was finally at peace. Silence once broke me. Now, it keeps me safe.